welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. We've traveled south of the Mason-Dixon line and we're on the Bull Run Battlefield or the Manassas Battlefield. We're going to talk about the structure behind me today. I'm joined by the Acting Chief of Interpretation, Andrew Bentley, who had a lot to do with this. Andrew, thanks for coming on with us.
Well, thanks for coming out. We're happy to have you here.
Well, before we even talk about this structure, let's place it here on the battlefield. Where are we here?
So today we're actually on the Portici plantation. This was a plantation owned by Frank Lewis during the time of the war. It was considered a middling plantation, so it wasn't one of these massive plantations that you think of in the kind of the prototypical South. A more diversified agriculture. And it was on this landscape here that there was a significant amount of military activity during both First and Second Battles of Manassas, as well as the inter-battle periods where you have lots of military occupation. So that's where we are today with the winter quarters behind us.
All right, and you've said winter quarters, and you said there's battles and there's inter-battle. This is inter-battle, correct?
Yes. So after the First Battle of Manassas, as both armies were kind of left reeling, they settled in for the long winter with Joe Johnston's army of about 40,000 men, stretched from Centerville just east of here, all the way down to Manassas Junction to our south, with brigades kind of scattered across the landscape. So on this landscape here, the Confederate Army during the winter of 1861 to 62 set up their winter quarters.
So who was here at Portici in the winter of 61?
Here in Portici, near the Lewis House, as the soldiers note, was Wilcox's brigade, which consisted of an artillery detachment, as well as the 38th Virginia, the 19th Mississippi, and the 9th, 10th, and 11th Alabama.
And how long were they here?
They were here from about late December of 1861 until early March of 1862.
Seems like a pretty late time to be starting winter quarters.
It was. They were moved from picket duty along Cub Run just east of the battlefield here, and were moved here in late December and then finally allowed to go into the winter quarters after much of the army had already been allowed to.
So Andrew, talk to me about what this structure represents.
So this is a reconstruction of a winter quarters. We used a little bit of experimental archaeology to build this, but it's based off of a lot of archival evidence.
All right, and let's help folks who maybe aren't as up to date with some of the terminology we use. Talk to me briefly about what experimental archaeology is and its place in interpretation.
Experimental archaeology, in a nutshell, is essentially taking the means, methods, and materials that the people at the time would have had and trying to accomplish the similar end goal that they had to set out to do without really the exact roadmap, step-by-step instruction of how they would have gotten there. So taking the same tools, materials that they had available to them and the skills they had available to them and trying to accomplish the same thing that they did, and then seeing what your end result looks like. So in this instance, we did exactly that, and it turned out looking very, very similar to the original images.
So talk to me about what it took to design this building.
Absolutely. So the design of this is derived from three primary sources. It's from the archaeological record, from the site here actually where we have done archaeology. It's from Library of Congress images, and then it's also from the soldiers' accounts themselves.
Well then, can I stop you and have you, what comes from what?
Absolutely. So the general overall footprint design and layout is informed largely by the archaeology. The archaeology shows us that these were largely temporary structures, as a winter quarters is wont to be, that were built on grade. They're built on very low stone foundations with scarcely any stones at all. So these are dirt floors. They weren't dug in. The archaeology shows us that unlike later winter quarters that you see throughout the rest of the Civil War and kind of what your mind thinks about with the winter quarters, these were not dug into the earth. These were built on grade and on level ground. It also informs some of the chimney stacks themselves, where the chimneys were not built out of these massive stone pillars. You can see a chimney pile in some of the archaeology where there's a cluster of stones indicating that there may have been a little bit more reinforcement, whether it's the inside of the hearth or just around the foundation of itself. So again, the archaeology speaks to that. And then the overall form and massing of the buildings, it gives us a nice footprint, a size from anywhere from 8 by 8 up to a 12 by 20 structure.
And what are we looking at here?
So this is an approximately 12 by 12 cabin. So this is kind of on the intermediate end of the spectrum, well, the middle range, if you will. The structures that we see here, again, are somewhat smaller than this and like this, but almost twice as long in some instances.
So that's the archaeology. Let's go to the photography.
So the Library of Congress images are actually really informative because of the high resolution of those. You can really get granular with them. Looking at images from Centerville and ones particularly from the Manassas area that are labeled as being from Manassas. That doesn't necessarily mean Manassas Battlefield proper right here, but in the Manassas area, we're able to glean a lot of information and look at stylistically how they were built. They were primarily log structures that were not, cleanly hewn on the outside, often not debarked. They used a lot of reused materials salvaged from buildings that were either war damaged or abandoned and just picked apart. Roofing is one in particular that we replicated based off of an exact image from the Manassas area, where it's a board and batten roof, unlike a cedar shingle roof that you might see, or the canvas tents that you see later. This one was using a lot of lumber, but it was a very expedient method for the soldiers to get their quarters up.
Is there something to be said about the Confederacy not wanting to do as much damage to the local populace because they were theirs, that were using logs rather than tearing down whole buildings?
So in this instance, they actually pretty much picked the area bare. A lot of the surrounding areas had been somewhat abandoned during the occupation, or at least prior to the battle. So a lot of the buildings were picked apart. The Confederate government did try to expedite the building of winter quarters and to protect the resource by contracting out services for milled lumber and goods to be able to construct the quarters. But by November of 1861, that contract's pretty much fallen through. So the soldiers are left on their own hook to try to survive the winter. So woodlots sometimes get picked bare. Buildings like the Henry House were more than likely salvaged and reused for construction of winter quarters.
Well, we've talked about archaeology, we've talked about photography. Let's go to soldiers' accounts and how that helped you design this.
Absolutely. So the soldiers' accounts, again, really speak to the methodology of construction. There's a lot of really personal accounts of how difficult it was for them to build these. The ones that were built here at Portici, they built them starting in early January, so it was already kind of a miserable season. They were very late getting into their winter quarters just because they'd been moved around so much. So they had a very difficult time working in the muck and the mire and the freezing cold to try to get these up. But you had companies at a time hewing logs, stacking them up, doing the mud parging. The soldiers' accounts, again, really speak to the configuration and layout on the inside, which was really helpful for designing the interior of this building. We have a lot of information from the outside images from the archaeology, but how they were furnished, how they were used on the inside, the soldiers' accounts really spoke to that very well. So the bunk design that we have in there is based off of soldiers' accounts. The overall configuration, what we had furnished in there when we do living histories, is all derived from those accounts.
And who designed this building?
So this particular one was loosely designed by myself, again, based off all those sources, but we really did it as an experimental archaeology kind of exercise, if you will, for the park staff and fellow living historians to come out and work on this under the guise of the general framework I laid out. Here's the the original sources. Here's what it should look like. Here's some rough sketches, but to try to go at it the way soldiers that needed to just throw up quarters would have.
What'd you learn from the process?
The biggest takeaway was how extremely labor intensive this process was. Building a structure of this size the way that they did, which was all above grade, large timbers to build this, it's a full cabin, is very labor intensive compared to the other winter quarters you see that are dug in ground, much smaller for one or two men, is a far more expedient way to do it with the roofing. This is very intensive with time, labor, and material. So it was definitely a large burden for a handful of people to do.
And it would have been a handful of people living in there.
Exactly. Yeah, it would have been a handful of people. We know from the accounts as well that they built their walls all together first, particularly some of the Alabama soldiers. They mentioned that they get their walls up, but they haven't got their roofs on yet. So they're stacking the logs up together with companies of men moving these massive timbers around. But it takes time. It takes an extraordinary amount of time. And with them dedicated to it full time, it still took them almost a month to get into their quarters during the winter.
And how long did it take you and how many other people to put this thing together?
It took us about 2 months, and we had some assistance from modern equipment to move some of the heavier logs when we only had 2 of us out here. But there was a handful of us kind of on and off cycling through this, and it took us about 2 solid months to get this ready.
And you said a few modern tools, so chainsaws and stuff, or what did you use and how much did you do as the soldiers back then did?
So moving and positioning all of the modern, like the timbers, we used modern equipment with. So some of the heavier beams you can see on the bottoms, those were just simply too heavy for us to move with just 2 people when we were out here working on them. So we used skid loaders with grapple buckets to be able to move those in position. But all of the cuts, all of the facing, all of the nails, all of the fasteners, the joinery work, that was all done with traditional tools by hand, the way the soldiers would have done it, to get that experience for us, but also to have it be reflected in the materials themselves.
And when in the year did you build this?
I mistakenly built it the exact same time that they did. It was 160 years to the day when they started, I started building this. So it was in late December of 2021 that I built this, started building this, and ran all the way into February when I finally completed the project with the team here. So it was the exact same weather conditions. We had days that were 15 degrees with wind chill that were even colder, to some 40 degrees days that were rainy and just as muck and mire.
And muck and mire then becomes the chink and daub.
Exactly. So it did actually work out well with the mud that day for it, being able to chink all of the side of this.
So cool. Well, let me ask you 2 questions in a row. For the living historian, because I know you are as well, what's the takeaway from this?
My biggest takeaway as a living historian was really the scale of military activities, because we were operating with a small group to build this. So thinking about how many men it would have taken to build hundreds of these and how much material it would have taken to build hundreds of these, it gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of an army, a 40,000 occupying an area, which by Civil War standards isn't necessarily a large army. So you have a brigade just occupying this area with hundreds of huts, much less the entire area covered it. So it really highlighted just the scale that I think as a living historian, sometimes we focus very much on the material culture and the micro, but zooming back out to the macro of the scale of warfare was really striking for me.
Now, put that Ranger flat cap back on. We want people to come here and see this as part of their experience at Manassas or Bull Run. This is sort of tucked back. Why take the drive back here?
I think it's important for people to come back here because it's part of an overall landscape that kind of speaks to a lot of different histories, but it helps people understand the totality of war, I think. Like, we focus a lot on the first battle, the second battle. We focus on these high point events throughout history. And this area in particular was completely consumed by war for 4 years. It was constantly occupied territory. It was officially, seceded from the Union as part of the Confederacy. And then it was occupied Union territory for much of the war, with the armies kind of undulating, occupying the area back and forth. So it was constantly just oppressed by army and military activities. And this is a nice way to represent that on the landscape as just a singular example of that. It also provides, I think, a really nice touch point for people to have a really authentic experience, to come out and see how the soldiers would have lived, what they would have experienced. And seeing a structure like this, knowing that they would have had to build this by hand in those kinds of conditions, I think is a really compelling, visceral experience.
Have you stayed in here?
I have. The first year that we built this, I did stay the night in it, and the chimney and everything worked. It didn't catch on fire, unlike much of the original period accounts note. It's definitely not warm, but it is significantly warmer than sleeping outside on the ground.
Okay. Would you do it again?
I would, absolutely. I intend to next year.
Fantastic. Well, Andrew, thanks for hosting us. Thanks for welcoming us here. And thank you for taking your time professionally and from your hobby to share this with us.
Absolutely. Thank you for coming out.
Well, thank you for spending your time with Civil War Digital Digest, but your screen is not where this story ends. We hope you found a small connection to the Civil War through this. Now, use that. There's living history on top of the history of the Bull Run battlefield. Come out here to Manassas, see it for yourself. We'll see you next time.